Well, welcome back, everybody. Great to see many familiar faces and new names on this last edition of the panel series from Climate Farmers for this year. Although we've got a whole schedule lined up for next year, we're going to be wrapping up today with an exploration of policy, advocacy, and the future of regenerative farming in Europe from, well, our panelists who will introduce themselves shortly. And to give you some context, so this is the series that we've been running for a couple of years now, where we explore the topics and the interests, especially of the farmers in our community. There are lively discussions there. If any of you are active farmers in Europe, we would love to have you on board in our community, where we're constantly coming up with new support mechanisms and resources specifically for farmers in their transition to regenerative agriculture. And so let's get this conversation started today by going through some simple introductions to get to know our panelists. And let's start with Adele. Could you tell us about the work that you do? And we'll go into more details after we go through the intros.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here. Great fan of all the work Climate Farmers do. I am Adele. I'm based in Wales, here in the UK, where I live and farm. I am at the moment working as an independent food and farming consultant. Until very recently, I was executive director of an organization called the Sustainable Food Trust. So in a transition time at the moment, but really enjoying having a chance to work more closely with some different organizations and learn about regenerative agriculture in other places. So very glad to be here.
Marvelous. Thank you, Adele. Let's go to Tamara.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for having me. Likewise, I'm a big Climate Farmers fan. And there's quite a few people on this call who I think I've met before as well and had some brilliant conversations with. I'm Tamara Giltzoff. I wear a number of different hats, but a very important hat to me that I wear is an organization called Soil Association Exchange, who I continue to work with and have for about the last 2.5 years. I have just helped the business to launch into Spain. Exchange works with farmers to do baseline studying on farm and then advisory to help the farm transition, and then supports the farmer to access financing. And last year, I did a very interesting piece of work with Exchange called Banking for Change, where we explored the financial barriers to transition for farmers. I traveled all over the country, sat in the kitchen of farmers all over the country, and then followed up with an online survey to unpack financial barriers. And the report and the roundtable with all the banks has led to 3 of our banks launching transition facilities. So we're feeling quite pleased about that. But there is much more work to do. And I am very interested in financial barriers to transition within whole regions, within places. So the landscape transition challenge, but also the agri-food and fiber value chain and the transformation that needs to happen there. So I'm also working on something called the Place Finance Lab with an organization called Climate Kick, who's a seed funder of the lab. So that's probably enough for me from now. I'm in Somerset in the southwest of England. It's very green and wet until this summer when we had a terrible drought, but there's plenty of rain now. Yeah, that's me.
Marvelous. Thank you, Tamara. And let's go to Simon.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for having me. And I can go into the line of the two other wonderful panelists. We have also been very privileged at era of growing from and with climate farmers. So thank you for all the work you guys are doing, and also you, Oliver. I'm Simon. I have the humbling honor for the last 3 years of weaving and coordinating with a whole diversity of regenerating farmers from all over Europe, the European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, where in the last 2 years we have been so far mainly focused on research, producing systematic empirics of regenerating farmers and their results, together with policy advocacy, mainly for the common agricultural policy in Europe, now also working more on solutions, financial instruments, and so forth.
Well, I think you're a good person to start us off, because though the UK is closely matched with what's happening on a policy level here in Europe, and obviously there's a lot of crossover with the work of the other two, you're also intimately connected from the work at IARA in how policy, especially at the EU level, affects the actual actions and options that farmers have to make management decisions on their land. So can you give us an overview, or at least your opinion, on the power that policy and bureaucracy has in Europe to shape the way that farmers operate, and how the food system at large is capable of changing, or can be facilitated in its natural switch towards different directions?
Yeah, that's a great big question. I can try to lie down. I'll also share that hopefully today I'll learn a lot from the colleagues from England, because I think they have been freed of this policy behemoth that we have in Brussels over the last years. And I think some interesting stuff is developing from which we here in Europe can learn a lot. So far, of course, since the founding of the European Union, I mean, the second policy, the most defining policy of our European Union has been the Common Agricultural Policy, and until today it remains the largest part of the budget, and now we'll see how it goes forward. But I think apart from the subsidies, which super broadly one can say is something around $350 per hectare when we have an average revenue of $2,000 to $3,000 per hectare, is one part. But then, of course, regulations is another huge part which we often don't talk about. And there we have a lot of regulations which are impeding regenerating journeys. So, for example, now with the African swine flu, again, what is coming out of that in terms of animal safety regulations is mostly making it more difficult for smallholder or free-ranging pig producers, pasture-raised pigs, to produce in the way they want and we all want. So I think there's a big power impact on the food system. Then, of course, other stuff like antitrust law, which impacts the terms of trades of farmers. So we can go into the details, of course. I don't know if we are getting there later, but now with the Common Agricultural Policy, it looks like it's shifting a little bit, that more agency is flowing to the member states in terms of the design of the Common Agricultural Policy, but this has now also been revoked by the Parliament, so it is to see how the next draft will look like.
Yeah, this is such a dynamic time as some of these stalwarts of common agricultural policy are being disputed, and whether or not the budget that has been allocated to them in the past is going to be handled at the European level, or is going to be divvied up to the nation states. It's a very interesting time to be talking about this. Let's go back to Tamara. Can you give us some perspective from the many projects that you were involved in how regulation and policy shape some of the decisions for you as well as for the growers that you work with?
Yeah, there's two quite different answers to that. So there's the grower level for sure, through Soil Association Exchange, and then there's a kind of macro lens, and I can talk at both. So we have something called in the UK environmental land management, which is the kind of umbrella term for a number of subsidies, policies that replaced the Common Agriculture Policy. And the one that's sort of the most easily accessible to farmers is the SFI. I always get it wrong because I'm dyslexic, so acronyms are terrible. Sustainable Farming Incentive. I always say Sustainable Financing Incentive, Farming Incentive, that pays for land management practices and biodiversity outcomes. I think it's been really well designed. It's quite detailed. I'm not an expert on it, but it has been well designed. Our challenge is our UK balance sheet. So we, like a lot of countries, are struggling with a serious amount of debt of our own, and therefore budgets are being cut. And so, what is set out as a really good program has its limits. And they had to put a stop on the SFI program at some point last year, or maybe it was earlier this year, because it was so popular. Having not been that popular originally, it then got incredibly popular. So there are some very novel policies. There's also the landscape recovery, which is for funding for larger scale nature recovery. So what's been quite successful in the UK, which did actually stem from a policy initiative originally, is my understanding, is the concept of farmer clusters. So that's groups of farmers coming together to commit to environmental outcomes on farm, often quite ambitiously and very well organized. So sometimes up to 160 or 180 farmers. Typically, the ones that are working really well are in areas that are quite well connected to urban wealth, ultimately, and quite well sort of socially connected. And somebody at the helm of the cluster that's very good at organizing the cluster and therefore applying for landscape recovery, funding, and even institutional investment, or using government money to then apply for institutional investment, as well as going to the utilities like the water utilities and rail infrastructure utilities that may well sit on these large swathes of farmer cluster land. So I think the farmer cluster model and the original funding for that and how you can mobilize large groups of farmers is a really positive outcome from some of the policies in the UK. At a more macro level, and this is more my reflection, we are still not building the agri-food and fiber system into our industrial strategy. So we're not thinking about regional economic, we're not thinking about agri-food and fiber as core to regional economic development. It's still seen as a cost and a burden. And then there's separately a discussion around the food system and the cost of the food system on poor health and our NHS system, but they're not joined up yet. And so I would like to see much more thinking at macro, and hence the connection to the place-based financing lab. I'd like to see much more of a connection between our food system, our health, the fiber that we can produce to create the economies that we are committed to, not least building lots of housing, joined up at a regional level. And there's a lot of incredible work going on the ground in the food system and within farmers that should be playing into a larger industrial strategy. So I'll stop there. That's really my perspective, the second piece.
That's a brilliant overview, and I really look forward to coming back and exploring some of those aspects in more detail. But let's go to Adele. Give us your perspective on, well, the different initiatives that you're working on, but also your work as a farmer about how policy and advocacy, well, bureaucracy, I guess, in your case, helps or hinders the different decisions that you have to make.
Hugely is the short answer. And I should clarify that I'm very much a part-time farmer. As you can tell, I spend quite a lot of time sitting behind my computer. My partner Will and his family do all the very hard work. I help out on the side. But it's brilliant. I absolutely love it. And I love mixing my sort of advocacy work with practical farming. It's a huge sort of honor, really, to be able to do that. But no, policy really, really impacts decisions that we make on the farm. It's been a really tricky few years here. It's hard to believe that the dreaded Brexit was 9.5 years ago, almost. And yet many farms still are not entered into the new schemes. And even the ones that are very on the ball, it's just started this year, really.
Wow. So
it's been slow going. And that uncertainty over the last 9 years has been incredibly hard for planning, particularly as, things like the regenerative agriculture movement, quote unquote, are starting to build. And you might have farmers who are thinking, oh, maybe I'll try some of that, or a new generation of farmers that are coming through and thinking a little differently about how we produce our food, fiber, and other things. But actually, without that certainty from government about where the policy and where the policy is going, where the money will come from, it's really, really hard to then start thinking about changing your business. So I'd say the kind of lack of clarity and sort of lack of trust in the government. And I think that's very much playing out here in the same way it's playing out in Europe with the various protests that have gone on. And the protests, I think, in each case have been about something slightly different. But I think the underlying cause, I would say, is that farmers feel undervalued by society and by government, and certainly in this country by government at the moment. So it's trying to think about how, my work is how do we accelerate the regenerative agriculture transition in various ways, through finance, through through policy, through procurement, through measuring sustainability, whatever it may be. But really, governments and policy sets the bedrock for the direction of travel. And at the moment, with that, so it's a little more clear now, but I'd say it's still very much up in the air. It's definitely hindered the regenerative agriculture transition. I feel like there's so much energy there, and we see it at events like Groundswell. But actually, when it comes to practically implementing that on the ground, I hope now that the policy is a little bit more set and can be very much improved in some places, but I hope it will allow more farmers to start thinking about innovating. And then, of course, the private sector coming through is an incredibly important part, which I imagine we'll get to later. But no, it's a moving feast. I think Simon was kind to say we were freed of the Common Agricultural Policy. I think it was probably more of a curse than a blessing. So we'll see how it plays out.
So I'm curious, as a follow-up here, where you see the biggest hurdles coming from, because here in Europe, there's always the conversation about, oh, this is an obstacle at the European level, or this is being administered and implemented more on a local level. Is there much of a disconnect in the UK or in other places that you've seen where you have to communicate and navigate many different layers of overlapping jurisdictions that just make it a nightmare to figure out who you have to answer to and which regulations or restrictions you actually have to follow?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're probably much more broken up in the UK with our policy than many parts of Europe, because although Westminster in London kind of holds the inner core of particularly where Treasury money-based decisions are made, actually the policy is set in each of the 4 devolved nations. So we've got England, Wales, where I am, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And those policies, they are a little different in each place. And I think that's right, because the farming systems are a little different in each of those places. And for example, here in Wales, we have a lot of common land and farmers farming on common land. That requires totally different policy to much of England, even though there are commoners in England as well. So I'm on the border here in Wales. Where I'm sitting now is about 150 metres from the border to England. And we have a lot of farms in our farm cluster that sit across both. That's really hard to deal with when you're having to do half your paperwork to England and half your paperwork to Welsh government. So yes, it is quite difficult. And I liken it to my time working in government a few years ago. I did a year working in DEFRA in London, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and a year working in Welsh government. And when I was in DEFRA in London, the amount of bureaucracy I had to go through to try and get actually quite a simple policy pushed through, which in the end didn't, because it was more inconvenient to push through a slightly radical idea than it was to kill it. So yeah, I think maybe I had 10, 12 layers of people on top of me, and I wasn't, particularly junior in the department. So it was really difficult. Welsh government was better. It was much smaller. So I think, there was 4 of us in our team developing the Welsh agricultural policy, and there was maybe 2 people above us before you got to speak to the minister. But yeah, the bureaucracy is just mad. And, particularly farmers who don't have computers or, don't really want to be working on apps on their phone to take photos of things to evidence. Like, it's tough. So we've got to help those farmers as well as the ones that are really willing to try new technology and new policies. So it's going to be a bumpy ride over the next few years. But
I think one of the things that is different there, because I've just done this piece of work taking Soil Association Exchange platform into Spain. And so it's been quite eye-opening for me to see the differences and sort of see what, it kind of makes you quite grateful what does work well in your own country when you're looking at somebody else. And I was looking at sort of access to funding sources, largely the CAP, through regional and local levels in Spain as it's deployed very locally. And what we have in the UK, and we continue to have across all of our sort of economic services, is a good digital government service. So we have everything quite centralized in a digital system, which is relatively easy. I mean, Adele's experience it sounds like it's not easy, but compared to trying to navigate the CAP, which I had a go at, it actually makes what we have look quite simple, in all honesty, mostly because you can draw on data very centrally, very easily because of the way of our kind of digital services. So it does, it does beg the question that actually really good digital services and sort of usable digital services really come into play when we're talking about access to finance and funding mechanisms across any sector. But, this is the agriculture sector. So yeah, I will say that it was a striking difference to me. Yeah.
So perhaps you could continue on about where you see the biggest barriers and hurdles in this for farmers and for the enterprises that you're working on. Where's the difficulty? Where are you having the most trouble?
In terms of accessing government funding or...
And also just navigating all of the restrictions and bureaucracy that you're needing to jump through hurdles for.
Yeah. I mean, I think Adele, as somebody who's actually sat in government helping to design those policies and also applying from this, probably much better placed to respond to that. I think one thing that Soil Association Exchange has done well is to help just purely through the way that we implement our measurement protocol and then capture the data in our system. That in itself creates a kind of individual bank for farmers to then use that information to apply for and evidence outcomes for funding sources. So I have seen that work quite well. And this is what we're trying to do in Spain, is how do we match the data that we're gathering and the change on the farm happening in Spain, and then match that to funding sources and make that seamless and that process really seamless. So I think that there are things like that, how you capture data and what you ask farmers for, what level of detail you ask farmers for, and what, in the case of Soil Association Exchange, what we ask the farmer to do versus what we'll do with the farmer to get that type of information onto a platform. But I think Adele is probably much better placed to answer that question.
That's all right. And go ahead, Adele.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the answer is different for different farmers and different farming types, I think, because I mean, thinking very practically here, as I was saying, the digitalization of things like grant applications, verification and reporting, which is hugely important to me, but for some of the farmers I know and talk to, that is a big challenge, really, really big challenge.
Yeah.
And so how we help that kind of community of farmers who are not so tech savvy move is going to be a big thing to get our head around. And I also think the measurement and data stuff is, thank God for platforms like Soil Association Exchange, which are starting to really make it much easier and more accessible for farmers. But I foresee this as being one of the biggest opportunities, but also challenges we face as a farming community. We need that data, and we should have had it a long time ago, to be completely honest, a kind of baseline of farm sustainability. There was a report that came out this week from the Independent Grocery Adjudicator, the IGD, is that what it stands for? Anyway, whatever it stands for, I'm bad at acronyms as well, that suggested that there should be a national baseline of sustainability of UK farms. Which I 150% agree with, but why didn't we have it 9 years ago? We could have started this a long time ago in a very rustic way. I had a meeting with Michael Gove, who was our Secretary of State for Agriculture and Food back in 2017 when he was first in post, and we had a group of farmers talking about how we measure sustainability on the ground. And we suggested, why don't receipt of the basic payment, and through the transition of the cap for the period of the transition, be conditional on collecting some really, really simple data on an earthworm count, an infiltration test where you just bang a drain pipe into the soil and measure how long it takes for the water to drain away, like a soil vest test, and then a bird count and a insect count during the summer. Like, these are things that anyone can go and do, or even your kid can go and do them if you want them to. And he basically put the idea to his officials, saying, "What, why don't we do that? Why don't we try and start collecting this really simple data from farms, and then they'll keep receiving their money through the transition." And they just said, "Nah, computer says no," basically. And it just frustrates me so much, because even though that data would be pretty rustic, it would mean we have a really solid baseline of at least 7 years of data. on UK farms, and we just don't have any of that. We maybe have a couple of years on some farms now, which is it's great. It's starting to happen. But yeah, collecting data is I think super important. We have to start scaling it up, and platforms like Saks will really help with that. But it will be a big headache for farmers. So I foresee that being a pretty big hurdle that we have to get over.
This is really interesting, the topic about the data that can inform better policy. I want to come back to Simon now to give us more of a perspective from continental Europe, or at least the EU zone, in the research that you and your team have done at IATA, as well as the countless conversations and communication you have with farmers in your network. Similar to ourselves, where do you see sort of the biggest hurdles within both European level and member state levels of tying the hands of farmers who are trying to do their best as far as management, as far as decision making? Where are these difficulties mostly coming from?
Yeah, I think Adele said it pretty on the point. It's kind of a scientific and bureaucratic path dependency that has grown its checkboxes and lists and basically prescribes and demands compliance in terms of subsidy and regulations, and therewith upends the capacity of farmers to act context specifically. And as Adele and Tamar also said, the planning security of the whole construct is completely decisive for farmers to plan on. I mean, we want larger crop rotations, but we at the same time, for example, in the last CAP decided that member states and then often the regions who ultimately decide them, the eco schemes, so the payments that farmers get for mostly practices so far that they execute can be changed annually. So that is still going in the completely wrong direction. Maybe I can say that we see some hope. I mean, tying something together of what you have touched on before, the different levels which kind of trickle down and then make the complete subsidy and regulation corset that arrives at a farm in a specific place. So, for example, the WTO already prescribes some rules, which then in Europe, in Brussels, the European Union in the CAP interprets and then gives new rules for the member states for then again do the more detailed programming. And then in most of the member states, it goes further down to the regional federal governments to then finalize. And, you know, if you look in Germany, we think, oh, everything is decided in Brussels. In terms of the skeleton, somehow everything is decided in Brussels. But then really the specific eco schemes and a part of, let's say, the spectrum on how much you can spend in what bucket, how the bucket looks on the farm is mostly decided in the federal state. So trying to cross a little bit, you know, what we see now in AMS or SFI or even the farmer clusters, which I think is a super important innovation. If we look back why France today is I think in the data and showing much further innovation than most of European countries. I personally think the UK is catching up in a sense of many other countries in Europe. But they, in 2015, the agricultural minister, which also came from a rural background, he did exactly that. So they had this farmer cluster learning, then even still without this kind of big money coming in for helping them in the farmer with the landscape recovery projects there's now in the UK, just kind of the farmer clusters. And that already kickstart this peer-to-peer knowledge exchange. Because, I mean, you, Oliver, know better than anyone else that this is kind of the real capacity of the farmers to engage on their regenerating journey do not stem from prescriptive stuff, but really only from them following their own agency. I wanted to maybe one thing on touching on Adele and Tamas. I think we have, in some senses, I think it's good that we didn't do baselining earlier, Like now in Europe, we talk about the sustainability benchmarking. So that's basically our side of the same narrative. To me, there comes a lot of danger also with it, because it's still driven by the old bureaucrats and the old institutionalized lobbyists of the Conventional Farmer Association paired up with some others. But the whole innovation that we learn in terms of how do we do MLV from a regenerating movement perspective in terms of outcomes, continuous improvement, as little prescriptiveness as possible, it's not there. They just do again the longest checklist of whatever kind of stuff. So I think now we can do much better baselining where and I mean, I don't know so much about it, but so for example, the Northern Ireland Soil Nutrient Health Scheme, I think it's called, where we do free soil tests for all farmers to keep eligible for getting subsidies. I think that's a societal cost we could all take. It's not so much actually, and now with precision soil mapping and so forth, I also think like Adele, they lined out some of very simple soil tests. I think we can now also do very cost efficiently proper next evolution soil tests, which give the farmers super good knowledge to basically jump the J curve straight out of the gates if properly supported in terms of chemical soil balancing and having more cost efficiency with fertilizers and so forth. And then maybe the last point before is I think also in our study we did some kind of baselining, because we tried to correlate or show correlation between two very simple proxy satellite-based indicator and a whole what we call regenerating full productivity index. So a whole list of results in terms of yields, inputs, ecosystem services, and so forth. And there we can go back 8 years in the satellites and basically see how the fields in their own paleoclimatic context develop relatively and in absolute terms on photosynthesis and soil cover. So we already see some kind of baseline in terms of where we were starting and how they are developing.
Yeah, can you build on that a little bit? Because so we've been talking about the hurdles and the difficulties up until now. I'd love to get your take on the leverage points. And maybe you'll have heard, this will sound very familiar from the conversations that we've all had with farmers, but there are everything from, where they place blame, where all of this difficulty is coming from, all the way to conspiracy theories. Much like you said, it's very easy to throw blame all the way up to the European Union and say most of the decisions are made there, even though many of the details are implemented at more regional levels. There's blame thrown around about where money is influencing and lobbyists make decisions and guide how policy is made. Oftentimes, this is what is pointed to when policy or restrictions make it impossible to manage livestock or crops in the healthiest and most natural way that a farmer might want to do, but they need to jump through hurdles, much like you gave the example of the African swine flu now causing everybody to confine animals, which is absolutely not conducive to their optimal health. But this is not something you can get around at the moment, Who makes these policies and who's benefiting from it, right? Maybe you can give us some insight on where you see the biggest levers in actually changing this at the moment are.
I guess coming back to me, I think in Europe, it's very much a power game. To me, there's also a lot of geopolitics influenced. I mean, and that's not so much conspiracy theory, but political science in a sense. We can go back how the Americans opposed the very first common agricultural policy and where we're at with this today. And then see people influencing and organizations, how we design our agricultural policy and support for farmers. I think this leverage points also something that Adele and Tamara touched on is this seamlessness, because to me also, we talk about blending or stacking incentives in terms of helping farmers get more money while we are somehow unable to even imagine how we could really change the terms of trades of farmers. So if that's just as an example, in the 70s in Germany, a farmer got about 50% of what people spend on food. Today it's about 11%. And the concentration, both in retail and in processing mainly, I mean, are the most concentrated. It's an oligopoly we have, for example, in Germany and most of Europe. And if we put these more structural, political, economic policies, which you usually don't talk about yet so much, aside, then to me, I think it's really the seamlessness of the data, because then the stacking and blending of whatever kind of money, which from my perspective now can really only come from abating costs, because as we are going into recession and economic, it's getting more difficult, as our colleagues also shared. For example, voluntary carbon markets in the end always need some kind of nice capitalist who is ready to forego on more profits. I mean, now we call it putting nature on the balance sheet, so maybe it can go into as risk abating and so forth. But to me, that's also with the insurances is a big potential, and we are having quite some discussions. I see one very nice example from AXA Climate in France right now, where the farmers of cooperative agree on past margin, and they ensure their transition on that margin. And then some pioneers of this cooperative help the other farmers to transition. And this, I think, is like the farmer clusters or let's say recovery fund. You can then say, okay, here in this village, in this region, we have problems with flood insurances of houses, for example, or even, I think some, but I think that's the most Altama also touched on it, health insurances. If the cost of non-communicable diseases and so forth, if we are able to somehow correlate that or put that in quantitative models so the insurances and the back insurances and so forth can work with it, that's something. And then lastly, I think a part of public subsidy, there's also debt. So in some kind, we have in Europe, for example, we have 450 billion of farmer debt, another 450 billion of CPG company debt. Basically, all of that debt is as fragile as the supply chains of feeding into those debts. So you could both think about reevaluating the credit scores of those debts if farmers show more resilience or regenerating journey, and then what is already with some interesting examples happening, if that's the Rabobank Fund in soil in terms of reducing interest rates for farmers if they show positive results. I really think the seamless data integration, and I think, but please Tamara, I'll share more, because we had a General Assembly last week and our UK farmers were but maybe also because they were in a farmer cluster with a landscape recovery fund fully on the rails. So they were just, oh, amazing. So I think it's great that maybe the data seamlessness must go through the public and the private together, so that the farmer really has as little paperwork as possible while having all his or her headspace to focus on the agronomy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's something that I've heard time and time again from people, especially farmers, that yes, this data, this information is necessary, it's interesting, and they are already swimming in administrative burden and cannot stand to take on more, even if the data itself is valuable. Tamara, same question to you. Where do you see the leverage points in actually influencing and changing policy for the better, or perhaps even transforming it into something that can accelerate the transition we're hoping to see?
Yeah, just to reflect on that last point that Simon made, I think it comes back to this idea of a just transition. So it's often the farmers that are well equipped to either pay for somebody to do the legwork, the difficult work, or are part of a well-organized farmer cluster in the right kind of geographic location somewhere in the UK. And so there are swathes of the country where digital skills are much less, even digital connectivity in rural areas can be poor, and perhaps there isn't the types of skills that you need to lead a commercially astute farmer cluster. So it's not really a just transition. It's a very interesting model, but to do that well, there needs to be some real sort of policy drive around how do you really support in areas where, you know, there aren't people at the helm. There's a farmer cluster by me that's headed up by an ex-army leader. You know, it's like he just knows how to mobilize stuff and raise money. And, you know, there's a huge farmer cluster around here, not where I immediately live. My area here, there's absolutely nothing happening. There's tiny little conventional dairy farms that are just totally overwhelmed, don't sleep. When would they get time to participate in a farmer cluster or organize one? So it's imbalanced. But back to the leverage points, which was your question. I think Simon touched on a few. I think this kind of, and it goes back to my point in that DEFRA and farming has for a very long time been seen as sort of separate to economy. And actually what we're learning in this climate impacted world is that farmers are the keystone species of an entire economy, because there is no economy without food in the end. And I think as the rubber hits the road and we start to really experience climate impacts, we had an incredibly dry summer in the UK. We had a drought in areas of the UK that never get drought. And as a consequence, farm business models are really hit this year. And there are all sorts of other knock-on impacts of that I won't go into, because some of them directly relate to farming, some of them relate to other things just because of the cost of feeding animals this year. So yeah, I think this kind of intersection of farming and agriculture, and it always has been core to our economies, but we've just seen it as this other. And DEFRA has been an other department. It hasn't been at the centre of UK policy making. It is becoming more and more so because of the direct connection with health and food and the food crisis that we have in the UK. And we have a very serious crisis of ill health, diet-related ill health. And there are endless good reports and evidence of the cost of that poor health and poor production of food happening in the UK. So there's a sort of food burden. There's an infrastructure burden. So the impact of climate change on our core infrastructure, whether it's water utilities or rail infrastructure or housing that we are planning to build. And there's a financial intersection that relates to that Simon's already talked to in many ways. And then there is also a kind of intersection with social outcomes. What we're talking about is people's livelihoods and rural economies, and economies that we will depend on much more locally when we have another major shock to our food system. And major shocks these days are wars, trade wars, the next COVID, climate impacts, you name it. You know, we're living in a time of kind of existential crisis, and any one of those could really, certainly in the UK, when we are very dependent on importing food. Supposedly we produce 60% of the food that we need, but we don't produce enough vegetables here, as example, enough fruit and vegetables. We can't just live on wheat and dairy. And so, you know, we're quite ill prepared for that in the UK. There is more and more work going on at a local level and a regional level around, somebody's putting their finger up. There's more and more work going on at a regional and local level. So regional governments are producing food strategies to get ready for what I'm just talking about. And there's more and more kind of convening around local nature strategies. Well, we have to have that at local government level, food policies and food strategies, and much more kind of join up across regions in response to this. And I think actually central government needs to recognise the regional work and the importance of the food system to regions, regional resilience, and the region's ability to feed itself longer term as well, I would say. So I'll stop there. But I think, some of those big systemic challenges are going to be real major levers in this system. I mean, I can see a day, and if you listen to people like Henry Dimbleby, who at the height of the COVID crisis were sort of called up And all of the kind of CEOs of major retailers and food companies in the UK were called up and like, how are we going to feed our country kind of thing. There was no preparedness from a food perspective for COVID to hit in the UK. And that was only 5 years ago. And here we are again, still not prepared. So, yeah, I think the increasing discussion around systemic risk and resilience response will be a major driver for, in the end, accepting that farmers and landscapes are key to our survival on this planet. I'll stop there.
No, very good
Quite
point.
passionate about it.
Yeah, thank you. And so Adele, same to you. Can you talk about the levers that you see and the opportunities in this system to start to drive policy in the way that we'd like to see it?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with everything Tamara's just mentioned. So I was thinking of, how can I go down a different avenue? And I think a big opportunity I can still see is to really make sure farming policy incentivizes producing food, fiber, and other commodities in harmony with nature. It's still the case. I mean, I'd say it is better now in the UK than it was, but it is still the case that we fund food production separately to nature conservation. And there are some options available in the new schemes to introduce things like herbal lays, which is great as part of a rotation. But other practices like silvopasture, agroforestry, reduction in the use of chemical inputs are still peripheral, I would say. And, really thinking about how do we produce as much as we efficiently can on the best land, and then save the nice edges for nature. I'd say still the predominant sort of policy model that's used to fund farming. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to really think about which practices and outcomes we can incentivize farmers to work towards, which really put nature back into the heart of everything we do. And so I think that's a huge opportunity to keep working with government. And as much as I, like everyone else, complain about stuff that's going on, I think I definitely take the approach of we must work constructively with what we have, call out what's wrong, but try and make it better, basically. And I think that's what we have to do with the policy to really, I guess, make sure we don't fall into the trap of regenerative light farming, which I think is, we're seeing quite a lot at the moment, and making sure that even if it's a slow transition over time, we're really baking in that authenticity, but also resilience. As Tamara said, climate shocks are a yearly thing now everywhere in the world, I think. And so I think when you bake resilience into the system from the beginning, it's so clear, which farms are serving themselves well for the future. And I think that's a word we need to start using more. So yeah, see a big opportunity there.
I want to do a quick speed round now as we're starting to get to the end of my questions, and I'll hand it over to the listeners in a moment. But back to you, Adele. Where do you see hope in the current system? What gives you some optimism despite all of the barriers and the difficulties we've just listed?
I'm actually feeling really hopeful at the moment. And I think one of the things that makes me feel that way is that, when I started working in this world, which, relatively wasn't that long ago, it was, 14 years, I was the minority young person at conferences and events, and it really feels like a next generation of leaders is coming through. And that's no disrespect to those that have come before us, because they've really paved the way. And there's some amazing pioneers still out there on the circuit that we must pay homage to. But it really feels like I go to conferences, events, workshops around the world and hang out with my friends, of people that are fellow travelers. And I really love that feeling of community that we have. And it just feels like, rather than sending a boring email to someone, I just, give them a ring, because they're, we're all on the same journey together. And it just feels like we're a group of friends in this ecosystem. And that's absolutely lovely. So that gives me so much hope. And I think the same is true for young farmers as well. We're starting to see more and more of them turn up to events that in the past would have been quite stuffy affairs. So in that sense, this sort of new wave of energy is giving me a huge amount of hope.
Marvelous. I'm so glad to hear that. So Tamara, same to you. What gives you hope in this murky sector that we navigate in?
Gives me hope. I think there's no time like a crisis to innovate. And I think often these big challenges can lead to really incredible mobilization of things that we just couldn't imagine. And And I think I just said on the chat, look to the edges, because there's some incredible work going on the ground, both at a farm level, but also within the food and fiber system. And it's almost like a disease in itself. It pops up in one area and then you see somebody else doing it in another area. So there is huge amounts of hope. I think the thing that policy misses completely in all of this is the cultural shift that is happening and is underway with this shift towards sort of regeneration as a concept. And it's deeply creative, it's deeply cultural. Adele has said, it's very community orientated. It's the kind of antithesis of our capitalist system in many ways. And so who knows where that will get? It's not for everybody the all-in regenerative or agroecological approach, but even touching the sides of it has an impact, and there's a story there, and there's a different dimension and reconnection to the source of food and what food means and what soil, food, gut, brain health does to us as humans. And so I think that just doesn't appear in policy at all, because policymakers think in silos. And so somebody in the kind of health and social departments might be thinking about that. But I think there's something really exciting about that. And food as a dimension of that, as the most important dimension, it's our ultimate cultural output, is really one of our tools there. And then the other thing I would just say is people's voice, people's vote, and people's money. So the Food and Farming Countryside Commission in the UK, FFCC, have done some phenomenal work with citizen assemblies, really getting to the bottom of what do people want from their food system, because the big retailers in our country have for a long time said, you can't tell Brits what to eat, that's called a nanny state. And actually FFCC have done this phenomenal job of capturing what do people really want. And guess what? It turns out that everybody wants access to good, healthy food for themselves and for their children and families. And so that voice coming into policy making is really, really important. And I think we'll see more of that. And then connected to that, we're seeing more and more community-owned, community-financed, co-funded initiatives around market gardens, purchasing of land, new entrant farmers. So this evolution of the financial system around transition of landscapes and access to land is also hugely exciting, and it is happening across the board, across many different sectors, but it's also really happening in regenerative agriculture, and it's something that I'm following very closely with my work. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to say goodbye because I'm jumping off the call to go and play drums, which is what I do on a Thursday night. So thank you for having me.
No, Tamara, that is
sorry,
marvelous.
I can't answer any questions. Adele can answer my questions.
We'll follow up with you real soon. Thank you so much for making time to be here, and get out there and enjoy yourself.
Yeah, my samba jumps. All right, bye guys.
Take care. So Simone, back to you, my man. Tell me about where you find hope in all of this, as you are clearly swimming in the deep end of it.
Tamara's listed everything like this. No, I also see hope in, I would personally describe it as a co-evolution of our social and ecological regeneration. And I think that's both in the coalescence of pioneering farmer movements with youth movements, women movements. And we are working, of course, mostly in terms of the farmer movement. And I really think, as can call them next generation of leaders, but also just the next generation of farmers, is really upping the game, both in the social capacity and also in the agroecological capacities, because I don't think we see any flattening S-curves in results of their journeys yet. And I don't think we can even imagine them really coming from a perspective of how long we have degraded this planet and also our social capacities with them. So I think that, yeah, I see hope, because, if you look back into the history when we as people were able to liberate ourselves again from dominations and also from having bad relationships with each other and the earth, was always in co-evolution with the great farmer movement. And I think it's coalescing now again.
Yeah, for sure. That's also where I draw a lot of my optimism too, is the communication between the practitioners themselves and the immense creativity and resilience of people who are doing this work all the time. So let's open it up now to listener questions. I can already see some activity happening in the chat, and I will give priority to people who raise their hand digitally. If you're looking how to do that, there is a reactions button at the bottom of your screen. And go ahead, first person there. I hope I'm saying your name right. Is it Thayer?
Wow, I didn't know I was that quick. Yes, I'm Thaer. Nice to meet you. Thanks for a great conversation. My main motivation for joining today's call was I was first of all invited by one of your colleagues. He's also a friend of mine, which I just forgot his name. I'm sorry. He invited me via LinkedIn, and I'm working in the olive sector, regenerating the olive sector, specifically with olive mills, with olive farmers. And my main motivation was, of course, to listen, to see like the tragic we live in, not being able to make our own good food. And I just heard one sentence that really stuck in my brain was that we cannot live on dairy products and
wheat.
sorry,
Yeah.
wheat. And yeah, since we are working in this sector specifically, like I would definitely follow up with you guys to see where else we can go. But I also asked if there is hope, and you already answered a lot of this. There is, of course. It's a bit hard, and we're facing a lot of challenges ourselves. Yeah, but long story short, that's my intervention. Thank you.
Did you have a question they wanted to answer?
Yeah, I mean, my question is if there's any, like, I would like to connect and take action on this call and to see if there are anything happening in the olive sector, specifically as for like climate farmers.
Okay. Yeah, well, we can definitely engage with that, but I want to give it to our panelists here. Maybe as a broader question, how can farmers and other people who are interested in being active in this role, advocating for certain policies or, getting involved in some way, where do you see opportunities there? Go ahead, Adele.
Well, I think it's very place dependent in terms of the different ways that farmers can engage. But as we've been talking about, the farm cluster model in certain areas is brilliant. And if there's a way of funneling that through up to policy decision making, which I think is going to be a recommendation for something we have coming out here called the Farm Profitability Review, which would be great, then that's a brilliant mechanism. But I mean, that obviously farming unions are active in most parts of Europe, and generally they have until now represented the slightly more conventional approach to farming. But I can foresee that with a new generation coming through with a different mindset, that will slowly start to change. So I just think look for farmer groups in your area, and there will be some that are more radical than others. And just think about ways to share your voice, whether it's on social media or starting a podcast or whatever it might be. It's just there's so many different ways you can be part of this. But there's obviously great events around Europe as well, which I can encourage anyone who is able to travel to go to.
Brilliant. Simon, do you have something you want to add to that?
Nothing directly. I totally agree. I mean, can get engaged in many different ways. I would say locally, I mean, if you live in a rural area, like these kinds of getting in with the farmers, getting some agronomists is really nice. I would, of course, also say if you're in Europe and you want to get in with us in terms of thinking deeply about policy, you can join us, and we have a working group, and there we discuss all the developments will be tough and intense next 2 years, basically, for the evolution of European policy making.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add one thing to that too. Somebody is already doing it. It's always the case. Like, you don't have to reinvent another organization. Try and build experience joining in with somebody who's already doing this work, has experience themselves, and cut your teeth that way, right? It's so much less work in the beginning. And all of the organizations that I know who are trying to work on policy and agriculture need support, right? Instead of everybody trying to do this individually. All right, let's go to Damien.
Hello. Hello, Simon and Adele. Thank you for that hour. I put a little comment in the chat, but I realized it was too long, but I'm still going to try to make it short. It was about representativity in English of farmers. I mean, in France, most of the voice of the farmer is captured by one big union that is controlling every chamber of agriculture and the ministry and all the laws and what's being said in Europe on the French side, etc. But there was a large study that was done in French agriculture last year, and they did an inquiry directed to 8,000 farmers, out of which came that 93% of the farmers deemed to be representative were in favor of starting their agroecological transition, which is so different from what the union defending or representing them is actually doing. And so how do we, I mean, obviously EARA, that's part of what you want to do, and climate farmers as well, but how do we massify this to get really to the voice of farmers being present heard?
Simon, you want to start with that one?
Call it trying to build a coalition of the willing. And I mean, yeah, Paul also put it in the chat, and to us is trying.
Sorry, I'm back. I disappeared.
No worries.
But I said it all, so.
I mean, I will say as it's uniting in diversity, because it says throughout history always, I mean, we need to learn to cooperate with each other to lobby as one united voice to have a chance to stand up. Because also on the other side, I mean, we see it in Germany just yesterday, you know, our agricultural minister now kind of goes ahead with saying repurposing our agricultural sector for export, which is nothing else but the desperate cry of our large livestock processors, not even the farmers, but really the Tönnies and those who have the oligopolies in trying to getting into those spaces. And I think we need to stand together in terms of all the different farmer movement associations, as you said, not trying to reinvent the wheel, just growing the mycelium that's missing in our soils and in our social capacities for organizing together.
Yes, I would only add, I mean, it's kind of building from what I said to the last question, but I think showing up at events is really key. And an example I would give is in January, so in a few weeks' time, we have our Oxford Farming Conferences. They have been running, well, what the Oxford Farming Conference has been running for a very long time. It's a very traditional conference that probably represents the more sort of conventional side of agriculture. I think it was 15 or 16 years ago now. A small group of sort of hippie farmers basically said, we're not sure about this. We're going to be rival conference. And I've never quite felt comfortable with the sort of rival nature of it, but we're going to set up an alternative conference, let's say, which is called the Oxford Real Farming Conference. They both ran at the same time. They have done for 16 years. The Oxford Real Farming Conference initially was very, very small. It's now 5 times bigger than the other one. And so I think, you know, it used to be that the ministers, the farming ministers who come and do a speech every year at the conference, they would only ever go to the traditional one. Now they do both. And I wouldn't be surprised at some point if they only end up going to the real farming one, because that's where the energy is, that's where the people are. So I think turning up is really key.
Brilliant. Thank you. Go ahead, Edona.
Hi, everyone. Tuning in from Norway. I'm really curious. This is quite a concrete question, but if anyone has any experience with regenerative farming, agroecological farming being supported and growing in your countries or somewhere you've been working through public procurement of that type of food produce. So, of course, this is about politics, like politicians or the democratically voted for representatives in a country actually asking for food that is that has the outcomes coming from regenerative agriculture, agroecological agriculture. I mean, it's such a tricky world. And for my part here in Norway, there is a growing focus on local food. And I am really annoyed that local is just put up as the same as organic food, sustainable food, healthy food, whatever. Local doesn't mean that it has the same outcomes as regenerative farming, which you all know. So I'm really curious to hear any experiences, learnings on this side.
But I am interested to hear Simon's views. I have to say I don't have loads of examples because I absolutely agree with you. It would be transformational actually when you think about the scale of public procurement and the opportunity there.
There's much money in it, right? It's
yeah, absolutely. And it, you know, it really kind of goes back to the true cost accounting, a point of, you know, if we're, you know, why are we treating people that are sick rather than thinking about the cause? And actually, yeah, we all know the argument. But there is a project here in Wales. It's pretty small. It's called Welsh Veg in Schools. It started this year, and it's part funded by the Welsh government, part funded by one of the big caterers here, and they are funding organic farms to produce vegetables and then shortening those supply chains for schools. So that's great, but it's small scale, and I'd say it's, if anything, a bit philanthropic at the moment, and we need it to be commercial at scale. So I'd love to hear if anyone on the call has any examples to share.
I can only share that we in Germany I'm working with a very personally self-committed guy who's running a lot of outsourced kitchen for old people homes and so forth, for kitchens and also for public procurement, and it's a really difficult fight also because the budgets are kind of low. But I saw, if Paul is still in the call, I think, to my knowledge, at least in Copenhagen, and the project they have going on there is kind of the best developed I know in Europe.
Yeah, it would be really cool to hear more concrete examples of this, because as it's been stated already, the potential is huge. Stephen, your turn, my man. Good to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. I actually have a
public procurement, if you like.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Paul, go ahead. Because I also wanted to share just an example about public procurement here in Finland. My partner and I, we're new farmers, and came across an opportunity perhaps to actually leverage Finland's recent NATO ascension as an opportunity for selling regenerative agricultural products. Because NATO is a very niche or like very closed public procurement process, and there are very few food producers in Finland that are part of this public procurement scheme, suddenly there's an opportunity to perhaps provide regeneratively sourced food products to such a large scale such as NATO. Anyway, this was something that was interesting that we just came across here as an opportunity for our farm.
Thank you, Stephen. Paul, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of experience and successful cases in organic public procurement. It's also part of EU policy to promote that. I mean, Copenhagen is a good case, but there's a lot of cities, the Organic Cities Network, the Coach collaboration, where they've done excellent guidelines on organic public procurement and also how to secure local organic products. There's also increasing work globally with sourcing agricultural and organic products for school meals programs. There's a network collaborating between Brazil, East Africa, India on sharing best practices and promoting that. The Rockefeller Foundation and Novo Nordisk has gone into that in a big way. Seeing that as a real leverage point for organic and agroecological products from local producers. And then we try to use participatory guarantee systems rather than third-party certification as the strategy in areas where certification would be prohibitively expensive if it's third-party certified, although there are grower group models for that within organics. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of information out there, great cases, and that's a good pathway. And we also do have organics in military barracks, if you're looking at the NATO option there, Stephen.
Stephen, do you want to jump back in there?
There are also plant-rich meals, which was a discussion with the military.
I have an additional question. So if we want to stay on this topic, then by all means, but otherwise I would change the topic.
Yeah, I think we're good. Go ahead.
Sure. So like I said, new farmer here. And I think one of the things that I took away from this evening's conversation is the current policy landscape is certainly complex and leads to uncertainty, especially for farmers. Do you have any advice looking at the current policy landscape and looking ahead towards the next CAP to support farmers in thinking about planning with respect to current and future policies?
Great question. Who wants to take that one?
I wouldn't be able to give a very positive answer. I would say sorry I didn't know you. I was visiting farms in Finland this summer, but maybe you saw, and in Finland you have already a quite nice also organic regenerative group of pioneers that has a live exchange with the ministry. There we're discussing they might trial something more innovative we have been discussing in terms of coupling hectare-based payments to photosynthesis and other payment indicators, but I don't know what kind of farm you have. It's a market gardening or the like. It's still much more out, but I can connect you to or others who are relatively close to the ball in Finland, or the Baltic Sea Action Group, I think, is also one of the most active in Finland.
Patricia, maybe you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to give one example. Hi, Stephen, as well. We're almost neighbors. Lovely to see you. I'm sorry about my double Zoom here, but it's stuck on my mobile, so hopefully I didn't make you all seasick when I was trying to get it to stop working. But in Finland, I was about a week ago in an interesting presentation from the Ministry of Environment, where they are trying now in our region this sort of result-based subsidies as a small-scale trial. So they are doing it in our region, just a very small, I think it was about 300 hectares or something that they're going to try next spring, where they pay the farmers based on the results. And it was phosphorus in areas where we have high phosphorus in the ground. And there was a lot of farmers there listening, and it was really interesting. I think it's good that we have these pilots, because there's becomes also a discussion with the farmers of would it work and how would it work and what are the challenges and problems connected to it. The one thing that I think is a bit of a challenge is that from the policy viewpoint, you take something simple like phosphorus, because they think it's measurable, and then it's sort of easy to take one factor and one factor analysis, and then you go with it. But the farmers, I think some of the farmers have come to a point when they know that this is not enough, and that things are much more complex and much more needs to be done. And we have huge rainfalls right now, and it's way too warm and so on. So our fields are in poor condition. Of course, a lot of phosphorus goes out and so on. But it's like a bit of a mismatch in, yes, the initiatives are there, but then the initiatives should be more reality-based and more facing the real challenges of what the farmers have. And I have a feeling now that the governments are, yes, trying, but it's a little bit sort of, it's not enough. It should be the concept should be more complex and more thought through and more in line with what the farmers are facing. So I don't know if you have any comments about these input or sort of outcome-based subsidies, and are they going to be the future? And that was one big question that the farmers also had, that is this now the future for the next CAP? So I don't know if Simon or anyone else has something to comment about it, but it was just interesting that they are trying. But it might be that they're not trying because they have governmental issues where laws are not talking to each other, so they don't know until next month if they actually can do this trial or not. So typical governmental problem.
Maybe Adele, did you have anything to add on to this about maybe not predictions of things going forward, but from your perspective, what advice might you give for farmers trying to make plans or scope out what they're going to need to come up against from a policy side?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I would probably always argue, even if you're not entering into new policy options straight away, just making sure you get your head around it really early is key. And certainly in this country, where, as Tamara said earlier, the funding actually ran out for farmers entering into SFI, we've just started to transition into the new scheme because we're worried the same will happen here in Wales. So I don't, I think in Europe the budget is more sort of controlled and fixed. But I would say start getting your head around it early, and that might mean more pain earlier on. But I think it's definitely worth being ahead of the game. And to Patricia's point on outcomes, I think I've always quite liked the idea of outcome-based policy because it allows for that flexibility of different approaches rather than sort of funding for practices. But I think it will be a transition over time, and I think it will need really solid data. And again, that can be practice-based to start with and then move towards outcomes. So I think we should see it as ideally, I think we should see it as a transition rather than like, boom, next year we're entering into outcome-based policy, because I think it will be carnage. But I do see it in the future as the way forward.
One other question that I'd had kind of related to that is, and we've talked about the importance of data gathering and benchmarking in the beginning, there does not yet seem to be much of a consensus on what we should be optimizing for, and that makes it hard to decide what to measure. Do you guys have opinions on that? Like, do you see it very clear for yourselves that this is what we should be optimizing for? Or is it a matter of building clarity, building coalition? I remember there was talk about the need to have cross-sectoral and cross-department communication in order to come to a consensus on this. Either of you, Simon, or even people from the audience, Adele, if you have some ideas on this.
I think we all from the regenerating movement have a relatively clear, I would say. So far, I think the devil lies in the detail and the coalescence. We want to reduce chemical and physical disturbance and increase life holding capacity, which is photosynthesis and some kind of biodiversity in terms of vitality and quantity. I think we are getting there slowly, but I think where we have some pioneers here, when the organic movement coalesced around its, let's say, private certifications and frameworks into what we now know as public policy legislated kind of standard, maybe while not crowding out any kind of that standard, we can grow to a new level of kind of baseline, which is harmonized across our global food system while staying context specific and being very simple while not being prescriptive and producing the robust result and the development we need to see. But I think there's still a lot of coalescing going on. And also, I saw it here, I think a friend from France posted it in terms of even people working against the movement, certainly so. And certainly there are people, if we think of the ETC report on the global food system in terms of owning the majority of the food system, having quite an advantage in setting the secondary standard that might grow into the mainstream.
Adele, do you want to contribute to that as well?
No, I think Simon said it well. Maybe let's squeeze in one more question before the end.
Well, so actually, I'm going to wrap it up here because I have a couple of short announcements as we finish the season for this panel session, both through Climate Farmers and the podcast. I am really looking forward to this community contributing to how we take it into the future. Yeah. So not only those of you who have participated as speakers, but all of you who have taken the time to listen and follow these discussions, we really want to start to bring this into more of an engaging format. And the place to do that for those of you who are not active farmers in Europe will be with our accounts on LinkedIn. So as we post these out there, we really want to start to cultivate more of a discussion because there's so much knowledge. And just speaking to 3 people on a very broad topic like this doesn't begin to scratch the surface. I am very much looking forward to the contributions and to the perspectives that all of you have out there. So within the next 1 or 2 weeks, definitely before the end of the year, I'm going to be posting the schedule that I am proposing for our panels in the next year. And I would love to hear ideas for questions for people that we should have on to speak about those. And well, the other announcement, which we haven't really put out there yet, is that the Climate Farmers is going to be assuming the Regenerative Skills podcast in the next season. And what that means for us is that we're going to keep these panel discussions, but we're also going to curate the other episode. We're going to be doing 2 per month to do deep dive, almost investigative journalist style, well, yeah, looks into the topics of everybody's interest from the community here. And so I have a unique opportunity to start to really look into the data and go beyond just what we can uncover in the interviews themselves. And so I want to do this with you guys. Many of you are going to know a lot more about the topics that we need to explore than myself. And I see myself as much a curator and a facilitator for those episodes as an actual leader or a contributor. So that is another thing that I will hopefully in the next couple of weeks be posting a plan for. And for those of you who are interested, I'm very much looking forward to having a conversation on this and working on these together so that we can help to mature the conversation online about these. I think many of you will agree that a lot of these topics are often glossed over in social media and are reduced to sound bites, but there is so much room to really inform folks and to build on the depth of conversation that we'll be having together. And with that said, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. I want to thank all of you, especially for your contributions and for supporting this series up until now. I look forward to being in conversation with all of you in the upcoming year. So have a great holiday season and let's keep the conversation going. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Have a good
Bye
week.
then.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao.
Take care, friends.